This is a coin toss election and not one for the faint-hearted. The future of the U.S., but also the world, is being decided in front of our eyes. We're slowly getting a taste of what could await us on the other side of the race for the White House. But could it take weeks before we know the final results? Possibly. Considering an array of social and economic issues at hand, the choice of president will decide the future trajectory of America. Joining me now to talk about how the results could change the national as well as international dynamics of the country is Bryce Barros, Security Fellow at the Truman National Security Project. A very good morning, or should I say good evening to you. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for allowing me to be here. I'm very excited, and a very good morning to my colleagues in Central and Eastern Europe.
So as we're looking at this election, as we're looking at the results that are coming in, regardless of who wins, the world definitely must prepare itself for the new transatlantic reality, it seems. In case of both candidates, what would be the biggest changes that they would bring into office?
I think it depends, and the race right now is still very close. Many things could happen in terms of the different sort of ballots being counted at the moment. So I would still say it's on a knife's edge. I think it depends on, obviously, the administration. The Trump campaign and some of the policy advisors around him have been very clear about indicating that they want to see Europe and other allies burden share more. Poland, obviously, is not the source of that conversation, but other allies across NATO and whatnot are. I think with a potential Harris administration, you're looking at more of a continuation of what's going on with the Biden administration, especially if you look at who her national security advisor is, Philip Gordon. He's as transatlanticist as one could get, speaks multiple European languages, is very much invested into the alliance itself, and really is an ardent supporter of making sure Ukraine has what it needs to win the war.
So here in Europe, we're looking somewhat from the outside in, and a lot of people are wondering what's going to happen next. But I wanted to ask, what do you think were the top issues when it comes to the voters in the U.S.? What really made a difference and could potentially switch the vote?
I think there's a bunch of different things. So obviously, James Clavell, who's a well-known Democratic strategist, has long said, is the economy stupid? I think that's very much the case. I believe there's some polling that came out today related to concerns also for democracy, reproductive rights as well, inflation, a whole host of issues. Normally, U.S. elections aren't won on foreign policy. And oftentimes, I think many people that happen to work within the foreign policy realm forget that. But I think that those are probably some of the top concerns for many of the individuals who are voting and participating in these elections here in the United States.
You mentioned foreign policy, and I wanted to take a closer look at that. From a perspective of the U.S. voters, are they moving further away from actually caring of what's happening outside of their borders? Are they is this choice that is going to be made today or possibly in days and weeks to come is going to be the one that is going to actually isolate America? What's your opinion?
I think the discussion around whether or not the United States becomes isolationist is almost too binary. I think that one way of conceptualizing this is, yes, the current Biden-Harris administration is very much supportive of allies and partners across the world and whatnot, and has been very key on trying to get together coalitions to solve issues like Ukraine and whatnot, and bring in more European and transatlantic allies into issues related to the Indo-Pacific and even across the Middle East with what's going on with Israel. I would preface that I don't think that a potential Trump administration would be as isolationist as people perceive. I think it would be a lot more unilateral in the use of potentially U.S. Military, foreign, sort of military power. That's very different from being isolationist. Now, that does not mean that there could not be some problems that come from that. For example, wanting to potentially use military assets in a country that doesn't allow for the U.S. military to operate there, or other sort of things. But that's very different from being isolationist. If anything, that's more focused on being an extreme unilateralist.
And which group of voters do you think are going to make a difference in this election? Because there were different types of groups that we were looking into as we were covering the period leading up to the election. We've been looking at women, we've been looking at ethnic minorities, and I wanted to ask you what is your opinion, especially now that we're getting closer to the final results, and we're going to be looking into those 7 battleground states that could possibly turn the election.
So since we happen to be talking about Central and Eastern Europe, I do think Central and Eastern Europeans have been very integral, especially across battleground states. Something I think Harris did, obviously, in the debate that happened a couple months ago, highlighting the importance of Polish Americans in Pennsylvania, that actually became something that the campaign has had several rallies related to, focusing on messages of anti-Putin sentiment, supporting NATO, supporting Central and Eastern Europeans, and the idea that even though some individuals might be Polish American, Lithuanian American, other sort of different ethnic groups that come from across what is now frontline NATO states, they still don't want to see their homelands or the places where their families immigrated from fall to Russian aggression or any other sort of like external aggression that might be a traditional or non-traditional threat to NATO. So I think that those groups are pretty important. Other groups that come to mind might be some key parts of Asian American demographics like Vietnamese Americans. I think Mormons are really crucial to watch out for in Nevada and Arizona. So there's a lot of different things going on in addition to obviously sentiments of Arab Americans and Muslim Americans as well over backlash from the war in Gaza.
As of now, it's too early to call. But what do you think, considering how the voting is turning out right now, is the future of Ukraine looking like? Because for us here in Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe, this is one of the main questions. As you look at it now, here on TVP World, we're in Poland, and there is a war going on our eastern border.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately I think sometimes American voters, and rightfully so, very focused on whatever issues going on within the country and things that are immediate concern, might not realize how much their vote might have an impact globally, especially for a U.S. partner like Ukraine and what Ukraine has been able to do to stymie Russia's full-scale invasion against it. I think that at the moment, it really is too early to call. That can mean either thing, right? So there could have a concern in which you get, obviously a Trump administration coming in that's much more skeptical of providing aid to Ukraine, whereas you would get a Harris administration that'd be much more sympathetic to that. Mm-hmm. I think a big part of what could go into this is looking into what the breakdown of the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate might be. It definitely looks like the Democrats have lost the Senate probably at this point. However, that does not mean that there are not Republican voices within the Senate who are pro-Ukraine and still want to make sure that Ukraine has what it needs to win the war. It's also looking more increasingly likely that the Democrats have retaken the U.S. House of Representatives. So you might end up seeing a really interesting coalition of different senators and members of the House of Representatives who want to try to fund or provide aid to Ukraine in the event of a Trump administration's victory. We're working hand in hand with a potential Harris administration.
We're talking about Ukraine, but we need to remember that Ukraine is not part of the EU. Ukraine is not part of NATO. However, we had President Trump.
Oh, my apologies. Sorry.
Former President Trump said that some of the U.S. allies are worse than enemies. Who do you think he had in mind, and are we to be afraid of an American exit from NATO at any point in time?
Yeah, so an American exit from NATO doesn't have to look like a formal withdrawal from the treaty. It could be as simple as not using troops in a contingency. The U.S. president is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces. Even if Congress has created measures to make sure that NATO, that the United States remains as a member of NATO, if the U.S. president does not want to use U.S. troops to defend NATO, that's a de facto way of not pulling one's weight in the treaty unto itself. So I think that that's actually a bigger concern than the United States formally withdrawing from NATO.
Thank you so much for joining me then.
Thank you.
This was Bryce Barros, Security Fellow at the Truman National Security Project. We will be back with you in just a moment, so stay tuned as we will bring you more on the earliest results of the U.S. election.